It's 9 a.m., so we're going to get started. I do want to see if I can leave some time for live questions today, if I can. I know I tried yesterday, or tried last week, and failed miserably. But this time will be different, because that's what I always say. All right. Today last week we talked about six-day creation, six-day creationism, and I gave you a series of reasons why you, like me, should also be a six-day creationist. Is this going to work? Oh, wait. Is it up or down? I always get this wrong. It's down. Yeah, it's not working. Okay. Was that me? All right. All right. I gave you a series of reasons why you should believe in young earth creationism or six-day creationism and a young earth. And just by way of review, the first reason is just a plain reading of Genesis 1 doesn't lend itself to any other interpretation. The word yom, or day, just means a plain 24-hour day unless you eisegete, or unless you basically read into the text something different. And then, of course, the fourth commandment is one of the, I guess, the most difficult verses to get past if you are trying to read long ages, because it is literally the justification for the Sabbath. If you, basically, in 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, and then he rested. And if that 6 days that God used to justify the fourth commandment of keeping the Sabbath holy wasn't actually 6 days, what kind of model is that for Israel? What does it say about God's truthfulness? And number 3, the Genesis genealogies taken, there's two main genealogies in Genesis. The way it's written in the original Hebrew language does not lend itself to sticking in millions of years in there. Doesn't even really lend itself to sticking in extra generations. So you just can't fit millions of years after Adam. And the fourth reason is you can't fit millions of years before Adam. There's testimony from Jesus and the apostles that simply doesn't make any sense, or is just wrong if you don't believe in six-day creation. And then the last two we'll see today, actually in a few minutes, are very important, because if you believe in long ages, if you are looking at creation in terms of billions of years, then you basically cannot believe in a global flood, or the global flood just simply does not make sense. All of the evidence that you're interpreting in order to justify billions of years would have been washed away in the global flood. So you really can't be consistent. You can't believe in the global flood. However, the problem is, if you look at the scriptures, there's a lot of problems if you don't believe in the global flood. One of which is God making a covenant that he would never flood the world again. Well, that makes him a liar, because if you're just talking about that being a local flood, then he's done that maybe thousands of times. So the last reason is a theological reason why you need to believe in a six-day creation. And the theological reason is that if you believe in long ages, or if you believe in billions of years, you necessarily believe in death before the fall. So there's millions and billions of years, maybe millions of years of animal evolution happening during these before the fall, before Adam. And that means there's death, there's thorns, there's cancer, there's all sorts of things that we would today acknowledge as evil before the fall. And of course, we know that when God created the heavens and the earth, every day he said, and he saw that it was good. And he saw that it was good. And so you would have to say that all of those things were good. Death, cancer, thorns, and that simply does not jive with not only the creation account, but also the redemption story. It does not, if death came before the fall, what do you make about Romans 5, right? Okay, so that's just by way of review. And today I wanted to take some questions, and many of you have sent some questions. So I thank all the people who have sent questions. You sent really good questions, and I did my best to come up with some good answers. But if I didn't do well, you should let me know, and we will discuss further, okay? All right, so I have 7 questions today that I'm going to go through, and then at the end, if we have time, we can, as I said, maybe talk a little bit. in this interactive format. All right, question one. Somebody said, the Bible is not a science textbook, so why should we expect it to be scientifically accurate? This is obviously a very common question, and all these questions, I have to say, I kind of massage the wording a little bit because sometimes the questions are kind of long and have a lot of context. So anyways, question one, why should we believe the Bible, being that it's not written to be a science textbook, all right? And I think the best answer to this question, if you ever get it, which you will if you try to defend young Earth creationism, is we're very thankful that the Bible is not a science textbook because science textbooks are wrong all the time. And in fact, if you look back even in your physics textbook, what does it say in the bottom? It usually says 3rd edition or 4th edition, right? Why? Because it keeps becoming outdated. Every 10 years, you have to write a new science textbook because not only is the knowledge updated, but also the way that the conventional wisdom is to present things is outdated. And that doesn't happen with the Bible, right? We don't have 3rd edition of the Bible and we add like verses and we add like books, at least not that I'm aware of. The other thing is that the Bible must at least be as accurate as a science textbook. Now, you have to understand, of course, that we're not going to interpret it in a wooden, literal sense like Pastor Dave was telling us in the biblical hermeneutics class. We interpret it in the genre that is written. So you don't look at poetry and try to make some sort of scientific deduction from some of the poetry. However, Genesis 1 through 3, as we talked briefly about last time, is not in a poetic genre. It is in a narrative genre. And so if the Bible itself, as I said, I think in the beginning of last week's Sunday school, if the Bible itself cannot be trusted to be accurate even in the earthly things, then why should you trust God at all in any of the heavenly things, right? This is a verse that I think I brought up last time. If I told you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? And I submit to you that if you don't believe in the Genesis account as accurate, then you have no reason to believe that anything else in the Bible is accurate, unless you have a very inconsistent way of interpreting the Bible. So I really like this question, actually, because one of the things that I think I told you about last time was that I am obviously a scientist, or I do have a PhD, and so I didn't tell you that to sort of like, play up my credentials. In fact, many of you, I've never said that. I almost never say that, right? Because nobody cares, right? But the reason I bring it up is because I want to let you know that I know how the sausage is made. I have a friend back in high school who worked at Denny's, and he was, I guess, a line cook at Denny's. And we were sitting around one day and we're like, hey, where should we go out to eat? We should go and grab a bite to eat. So I was like, well, why don't we go to Denny's? And he's like, no, never go there. Never go to Denny's. And I was like, why don't you want to go to Denny's? Don't you work there? He's like, I know exactly what happens there, right? I know exactly okay, no, Denny's is fine probably, but back then, basically the point is that if you're in the environment, you kind of know how the sausage is made, and you never want to eat there, right? And so that goes for science. I do believe that in having gone through a PhD, my understanding of science, or how the scientific process works, and who scientists are, is forever transformed, right? These are just human beings, just like you and me, sinners, just like you and me, with agendas, a lot of times, just like you and me. There's nothing special, there's nothing priestly about them. They're not particularly more objective than anybody else in the world. Okay, so if you are a person who really trusts science, I just want to bring up a few points to you. One is the consensus of scientists ever wrong? So does anybody remember what this is over here? It's the food pyramid, right? I'm sorry, this is the food pyramid. And of course, from when I was growing up, this is what was taught, right? So you ought to eat like mostly bread, and then as you sort of like maybe a few vegetables and fruit, and then like butter and jam or whatever. I don't know what that is on top. But anyways, milk. So now, in the last 20 years or so, this has been completely debunked. Even scientists are like, that was completely wrong, we shouldn't have done that. And, I don't know what the pyramid is. I saw like an inverted pyramid or something now, I don't know, but Khalif would know more than I would. But here we see that science is wrong. Science is wrong in that instance, but it's actually wrong a lot more than that. You have to understand that what you read in the newspapers or in the websites are generally going to be outdated. And okay, but you say that was like 20 years ago. What about now, right? Like, obviously, scientists today are different. They're getting it right now, right? Well, you see, you guys have all lived through, you're older than 5 years old, so you guys have all lived through COVID. And whatever you think about everything that happened in COVID and all the masks and all the vaccines, all that stuff, whatever you think about that, it's undeniable that public trust in science or medicine has really dipped to an all-time low. So it's a little hard to see on this graph, but this is basically like how much people trust is a function of time, and this is like the number of years over here. And this is from the, some sort of Harvard journal. And you see that it's gone from like 70% to 30% in like the span of, 5 years, right? And that's because we all know that, during COVID, whatever you think about all of these things, people were standing up and saying things that literally were proven wrong a year or two later, right? Or it was proven that what they said was maybe agenda-driven. And I don't want to become any more political than that, but I'm just going to show you this slide. Who knows whether this is true or not, but there was in 2023 a House hearing about the lab leak hypothesis, about how the COVID came out of Wuhan, right? Did it come out of the lab or not? And whatever you believe about that, the only thing I want to show you is that even the highest level scientists in the world have been at least accused of being agenda-driven, right? And not saying things that are objective because they have an agenda. But, as you say, my point here is not to tell you to distrust all scientists. It really isn't. Some science is true, and many scientists are people who are objective, and or at least try to be objective and try to do the right thing. But here's the things you need to know as people who are consuming scientific information. One is, most popular reports of scientific articles are sensationalized, right? So if you look on like CNN or Fox News or New York Times or whatever, and you say, hey, look, they just discovered this new fossil or whatever, or they just discovered like a new whatever. That's a sensationalized article. And many times, as I said, I know how the sausage is made. You actually go into the scientists and you ask them, is this article accurate? The scientists that they're citing, and they go, no, they shouldn't have said that. This is like way too much conclusion to draw based on the data. But of course, the people writing the news articles, the science writers, they sell ads based on how sensational the articles are, right? So this has been going on for many, many years. All of these articles are sensationalized, and they claim more than they really justify. As I said before, scientists are just people. They're not smarter than you, and you shouldn't automatically believe them, just like you would not automatically believe anybody else who tries to sell you something, right? One red flag, whenever you meet anybody, actually, but especially science, is when they try to suppress your opinion, or when they try to suppress or debate or silence dissent, because real scientists don't do that, right? Okay, well, at least good scientists don't do that. Good scientists, in fact, thrive on skepticism, and they thrive on disagreement, because that's how progress is made. You look at your theory, and somebody says, I don't think that's right, and you're like, okay, well, now I can test that, and if you're right, then we can advance our knowledge. But if somebody's like, well, I'm gonna like, cancel you, and now I'm gonna, make sure nobody hears from you ever again, you're never get a job in this industry again, that's not science. That's basically politics, right? That's inquisition. Okay. So why the tension here? Because as I said last time, we live in an explosion of technology. We live in an explosion of the technological age. And our eyes have demonstrated to us that much of science is almost magic, right? Just look at what AI has done. Look at what you hold in your hand with your mobile phone. But you need to not over-extrapolate from that. You need to understand the difference between science and dogma, right? So you guys, we talked a little bit about this last time, but I really think it's an important point that every Christian needs to be aware of the difference between science and dogma. Okay. So one tactic that you'll see about, from old earthers that really try to use this fallacy. And I'm just going to go through two fallacies I want to understand, because I think we need a new vocabulary for this age that we live in. We live in an age with more information than ever, but it's harder to tell the truth than ever, right? And so if somebody ever comes and tells you no scientists believe in six-day creation, they're using something called the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? Which is, okay, you can't read this. Can you read this? No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge, and Scotty says, but my uncle is a Scotsman, and he puts sugar on his porridge. And then the person says, yeah, but no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. And you're defined scientists to be like the group of people who agree with you, right? And so when people say, no true scientists believe in six-day creation, well, I can tell you from firsthand experience, I'm a scientist who believes in six-day creation, but also I know many other scientists who believe in six-day creation. And then some people may say, yeah, but they're not real scientists. I mean, come on, right? You've defined scientists to a narrow group of people that agree with you. So this particular point has really been used to push this agenda relentlessly, to sort of browbeat Christians into thinking that if you believe in six-day creation, you're going against all of this sort of like agreement on scientists' part. And that's just simply not true. Of course, the majority of scientists who are secular and come from naturalistic presuppositions would agree with that. But there are a good amount of people who don't. All right, and then this is the next thing I want to show you. This is also another way that I think we need to think about the world that we live in and how to evaluate science, all right? So there's a popular term that was coined called Gell-Mann's amnesia. And what is this? So if you look at the comic, you'll see this guy's reading a newspaper and he says, this is nonsense, who writes this stuff? And because, let's say, what do you think? Okay, so like you know something about accounting, and then like Mike looks at the newspaper, he's like, that's not right. Like they're just completely lying about this. This never happens, of course, right? But anyways, like we've all had this experience. We look at the newspaper, we're like, that's very biased. That's completely slanted, or that's completely wrong. But then you read about something you don't know, right? So maybe you don't know much about, creationism or whatever, or you don't know something about some sort of other topic. And so you read about that and you go, huh, I didn't know about that. I guess that must be true. Now, we all have this bias, right? We all have this bias to just simply believe when somebody tells us something that we don't quite know about. But just like the last article we read, we're like, that's completely lying. Well, what's more likely, that only the article that you just read is wrong, or are they all wrong, right? And the reality is, they're generally all wrong. So you just have to be discerning as a Christian, right? This is what the definition is. When you encounter a news article covering a topic that you're subject matter expert to, and you notice a lot of errors or misunderstandings, but then read another article by the same publisher and just assume that it's accurate, all right? This is from a very reputable source called Elastic Dog. But anyways, we live in a very strange world. So generally, I think the less you know about science, the more you put your faith in it. Okay. All right, I already talked about this stuff, so I'm not going to say it again. But basically, be able to distinguish what is science and what is dogma. And be careful who you trust. Scientists are just people. If it's not the scientific method, then you should understand that it's dogma, right? Be as wary as serpents and as innocent as doves. That's Matthew 10:16. Okay, I beat that to death. Okay, right. Okay, question 2. how do people who believe in old earth reconcile themselves to the Genesis account? So, I gave you many reasons to believe in six-day creation, but how do other people believe? And how do they reconcile that to their points? So, as I showed you this slide last time, this is just a non-exhaustive list of all of the different competing theories of trying to reconcile the Bible with old earth, with billions of years. So I'll just talk briefly about this, not too long. But the gap theory is the first one you see there. This is also called ruin reconstruction, and this is a truly strange theory, but it was actually a widely accepted theory, many years ago. I haven't heard about it much recently. But the idea here is that in the far distant past, God created a perfect heaven and earth, and then there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, they put in billions of years, and they put in a whole lot of mythology in here, okay? So this is where, in this gap, Satan was the ruler of the earth, and he had a whole people on the earth living that didn't have any souls. Now that's important, because you have to, if they had souls, then they could be redeemed by Adam. But Adam's the first man, didn't come till later, right? So you have to have these people without souls. Very strange. Okay, so eventually Satan dwelled in the Garden of Eden, rebelled, and then Satan fell, sin entered the universe, brought on earth God's judgment in the form of a flood. Now this is not Noah's flood. This is Satan's flood. And then there was this global ice age, heat from the sun was removed, and then, it's called Lucifer's flood. And then plant, animals, and fossils on the earth today came from that era. Okay, so everything, all of these fossils or whatever that you see is actually from Genesis, between Genesis 1:2 and Genesis 1:1. So obviously the first question you should say is, where is any of this in the Bible? And they actually do have some weird, they have some eisegesis in there. But it's just not in the Bible. It's not supported by anything. And also, Exodus 20:11 comes to block this again, right? Exodus 20:11 is a very useful verse because it says, in 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth. And if you put a bunch of, billions of years in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that's no longer true. You still have death and disease before the fall, and that's still necessary. And Lucifer's flood, this sort of mythological flood between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, doesn't actually solve anything because that's also a catastrophic event. So remember, the uniformitarian agenda is everything just kind of evolves over billions of years, nothing really catastrophic that happened except for maybe some meteors or something. But Lucifer's flood is another world-destroying event, and how can you believe anything, right? You can't believe any of the dating stuff, and all of this stuff basically is a little, everything's a little bit questionable. Okay, and also, you also have to believe that Noah's flood left no trace if you think that everything happened at Lucifer's flood. Okay, you probably didn't know any of this because I don't think this is a very popular view today, but it was a popular view 50 years ago or so, right? Okay, the more popular view is day age. So day age is basically every day in the Genesis account is maybe a few billion years or thousands of years. And they hang this on verses like 2 Peter 3:8, which is, days 1,000 years to the Lord. Of course, 1,000 years is like a day. So, and also that verse is not talking about creation, it's talking about the second coming of Christ, right? So it has nothing to do with creation. But the way that this day-age theory works is they accept the Big Bang as the model of the universe, and they sort of say that the record of nature that we see today is just as reliable as the Bible. And they believe, of course, as we said before, you have to believe in a local flood. All of these theories have to believe in a local flood, otherwise it wipes out all of your evidence, right? They believe in death before the fall. And they also believe, in order to get away from the Adam problem, like we talked about before, when Adam comes, everything after him is redeemable, right? So if Adam doesn't come until the end of creation, you have to have a race of people whose fossils are available before that. And so day-age theory or at least many versions, but like at least a few versions, have man-like creatures that existed before Adam and Eve that didn't have souls. And, they would point to like the Neanderthals or all of the other, all these little hominids that they find and say that they're different species. Okay, so what are the big problem about this is, as we said a little bit last time, the order of creation doesn't make any sense, right? So like if you look at the day age and you say like these are, even if you allow for some overlap, the earth is created on day 1. But the sun doesn't get created until day 4. So how are you going to get around that, right? So like, you can't have the earth older than the sun in any of these cosmological evolution theories. And it's just really weird to have hominids that are spiritless. Okay, and then there's another version of this that say like, maybe just the first 3 days are ages. The first 3 days are ages. Okay, so we'll talk about that actually separately in a second. All right, so there's probably the most common interpretation today is actually called progressive creation, which is, I think, somewhere down here. Right, progressive creation. So this is a little bit weirder. Okay, sorry, this is, I forgot to advance the slide. So this is like, where do you fit millions of years? There's only really 3 options, right? Either before Genesis 1:1, between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, which is a gap theory, or you spread it out. So day age is sort of spreading it out. And this is the problem with all of them. For all of them, you have death before sin, right? Okay. So do I have another slide on this? No, I guess not. All right. What did I want to say about progressive creation? So progressive creation is a little bit weird. I thought I had a slide in it, but I don't. It's that God created in stages. So he creates like animals, and then they die out. And then he creates like more animals, and then they die out. And they creates like more animals, and they die out, right? So eventually, then he creates humans. So what this allows you to do, I guess, in some way, is that you are able to reject biological evolution because you can say that God created these things in stages. So it's still God creating. But you try to read in all of this astronomical and geological evolution. So anyways, it's the same problems as we had before. There's still death before sin. Still, the order of creation doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, some people, it's called the framework hypothesis, which I had before. Some people just allegorize the whole thing. So it's just like, all of this is like a story, and you have to kind of make some morals out of it and, evaluate it like you would evaluate a myth. But they would say it's not a myth. But it would be like one of these things where you have to read it like poetry and not really have to look at it as literal days. So those are the different views. And I think none of them really hold up. All of them are kind of a little bit more ridiculous, in fact, than 6-day creation. Okay, let's see. Let's try to move a little faster here. Question 3. If the sun was, this is a follow-up question. If the sun was only created on day 4, then how can we be sure that the first 3 days were exactly 24 hours? And is it possible that you can interpret the first 3 days as non-solar periods, and then maintaining, days 4 through 7 are ordinary 24-hour days? And first of all, you would ask, well, why would somebody want to do this? And the reason somebody might want to do this is because you can then reject this molecule-to-man evolution, but you can keep your cosmological evolution, right? You can basically say, yeah, the Big Bang and all this stuff is true. That's in the first 3 days. And then all of the animal and stuff, that stuff is, God created like the way that we would read as 24-hour days. Okay, so what are the problems with this? So one problem is you don't get this theory unless you're really trying to do that. Like you have to have that motive, right? Secondly, there's no reason, as we said last time, to interpret yom, the word day, differently in days 1 through 3 and days 4 to 7. Both of them say evening and morning and the next day, right? And of course, we always go back to Exodus 20, which says in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. So that doesn't make any sense at all, right? if you believe that the first 3 days are somehow different millions of years. But there's other problems with this. So one problem is that when are the plants created? The plants are created on day 3. That's before day 4, right? So somehow you are having plants and trees, and then there's evening and morning. Okay, so unless you want to completely spiritualize evening and morning, and then there's the sun, you have like maybe billions of years of plants living without the sun, which is extremely strange, right? Like you can't really understand that. That doesn't really fit with cosmological evolution. And also, day 1, there's a watery void. And day 4 is the sun. So the earth, again, is created before the sun. That also doesn't really fit with any sort of cosmological model. So that also doesn't work. Like none of those things can be reconciled. You really have to do a lot of violence to Genesis 1 if you want to read that in there. All right. And the last thing, one other thing that was interesting here, marking the seasons. So what is the purpose of the heavenly bodies? Did time exist? Or did it make sense to talk about 24 hours before the sun existed? And the answer is, if you look at Genesis 1:14, it says, God said, let there be lights in the expanse of heavens to separate the day from the light, and let them be for signs. So it doesn't seem like they were necessary to actually create the concept of days. In fact, it seems like the concept of days already existed, and they're just like the clock that you can use to measure the passing of time, right? So you don't need the sun to measure day and night. In fact, that's why it says evening and morning. What you do need is an earth, right? And maybe a light source, and maybe you're rotating the earth, maybe. But you don't need the sun. The sun is really there to just mark the days, right? And the last question somebody might ask is, why did God do it this way? Why did God create the sun on day 4 instead of on day 1? And you can't really answer that question with any sort of authority, but one speculation is maybe because God didn't want to put that much importance on the sun. If you think about what happens in Revelation, God is the light source, right? He is the light. And if you look throughout all of human history, you see that people worship the sun. In fact, a lot of people, there's Baals and all these other sun gods in the scripture. And here in the Genesis account, the sun is subservient. It's just a timepiece. There's nothing special about it except it's a clock. It's like a watch, right? But of course, that's speculation. Who knows the mind of God? All right, let's go a little faster. Come on. Question 4, what about carbon dating methods? All right, this is a very short question, of course. Okay, are they reliable and how do they fit with the young earth? And if we say they are not, are we being inconsistent when trusting for biblical archaeology? All right, I'll answer the first question first, and the answer is we probably are being inconsistent if we trust it for biblical archaeology in a very sort of like trusting way, right? And why do I say that? So what is radiometric dating? Radiometric dating is this dating method developed in the 20th century, actually after everyone had already accepted millions of years. And so it's not like because of radiometric dating, people have accepted, it's like that was already the assumption, and then they developed this radiometric dating. And how does it work? There's like different isotopes of atoms in the world, and carbon is one of them, and carbon usually is 12 neutrons, but or carbon 12, and then carbon 14 will generally decay into carbon 12, or all the time, but it'll decay with some sort of like very fixed half-life, or it takes like a very fixed amount of time for half of that carbon 14 to decay into carbon 12. So if you know sort of like how much there is to begin with, then you have a way to calculate essentially how long that carbon has been there. All right. So let me just repeat to you a point that I made before. If it's not testable by the scientific method, then it's not observational science. Okay? So let's say it again, okay? If it's not testable by the scientific method, then it's not testable science. It's not observational science. All facts are interpreted based on your assumptions. So no one can witness the age of the Earth, right? Can you go back in time and look at, when this carbon atom was created? You don't know anything about that. You have to make assumptions about that. So we can measure these isotopes, but then we are guessing at the time based on our assumptions, all right? Oh, wait, but God was there, right? So he actually has an eyewitness account. So would you trust the eyewitness account or a bunch of guesses? Now, what are the assumptions? So there's I don't know if this is going to work, but there's a funny video here. Is there a video in there that you can play? This is, they'll break up a little bit and see. If not, I'll just talk through it. Yeah, see if you just can play it. It's only like 2 minutes long. So this video kind of tells you a little bit about the assumptions. I'll talk about it later. This is a very corny video.
Any scientific method used to estimate the age of the Earth requires making assumptions, and that includes radiometric dating. To illustrate the assumptions, let's imagine something simpler. Suppose you walk into a room and see a flask with 300 milliliters of water in it sitting under a dripping tap. If the tap is dripping at 50 milliliters per hour, how long has the water been dripping into the flask? We don't know without making assumptions. It would be 6 hours, assuming the flask was empty when it was put under the tap, that the tap had been dripping at a constant rate the whole time, and that the flask had not been moved or tipped over. If we don't know those things, we can't be sure how long the water's been dripping into that flask.
Yeah, and it's the same for radiometric dating. We have to assume we know the amount of each isotope present when the rock cooled, and we don't. We have to assume that the decay rate has been constant, and there are processes that can affect decay rates, and we have to assume that nothing has been added or taken away from either isotope. Bottom line is, dating methods don't work because we can't be sure if the calculated date is accurate.
Yikes. You know, there's a simple way to check if it works. Just test a rock of known age and see if the dating method gets the right age.
That should do it.
Now, this has been done many times. In 1992, samples of the lava dome that formed at Mount St. Helens in the early 80s were tested by 2 reputable labs. Results came back at between 340,000 to 2.8 million years for rocks that were no more than 10 years old.
So that's a fail.
You can stop this. I just had to show that because I know there's some teens in it. I think that's like geared to teens or something. But it's actually pretty funny. All right. So what did we say in the video? It said basically that there are assumptions, right? So the amount of parent isotope that's present at the start. Now, what do you have to know to assume that? Well, you have to assume naturalism. You have to assume that you knew exactly how much given naturalistic processes. But how would you know if God created everything in 6 days? You don't know the conditions at creation. And you have to assume that the decay rate stays constant. And that actually is demonstrably false. Like, in fact, even the person who developed carbon-14 was saying that somehow it didn't seem to him like the atmosphere had the constant amount of carbon-14, and it seemed to change, and that disturbed him. So the other assumption, which is besides the decay, there's no other process that can add to it, that's also uniformitarianism. Both of these things form uniformitarianism. But we know if you believe in 6-day creation that all of these assumptions are wrong. First of all, you have to assume, of course, that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere is the same today as it was thousands or millions of years ago, or I guess thousands of years ago in carbon-14. So you have to assume that, but that's just demonstrably not true. And observational science has found, many sort of different things that violate these assumptions. So, for example, there's another radiometric dating method that uses potassium and argon, right? And that one, you have to assume the amount of argon in the rocks in the beginning. And the assumption is that argon doesn't get in the rocks except for that decay process. The problem is people have found rocks and literally watched it being formed with argon in it. So we know that that's not true. And the decay rate, there are many things that can affect this. So one is, it's been shown that magnetic fields on the Earth can change the decay rates. And also, the varying amount of cosmic rays can change the decay rates. So, whatever you believe about the flood, that completely changed the Earth and perhaps how cosmic rays work. And so anyway, so there's at least 3 instances in the biblical account that would really bust the uniformitarian assumption. One is creation, and the other is the curse, and the other is the flood, right? But you might say, okay, but maybe we can at least test it with rocks of known age, and this is going back to the question about maybe archaeologically, are we being inconsistent if we believe that? And we can see this table here. So people have tested, in fact, can you see that? Rocks of known ages, right? So they know when the rock is formed because they know from what volcano it came from, because there's these like historically recorded volcanic eruptions. And they test it with radiometric dating, and they have times that are wildly off, right? Potassium argon gives 170,000 years old for Mount Etna, when the rock was known to be formed 122, and there's a whole list of this, right? So again, I just have to say that if it's never been confirmed that this is irreliable, why are people depending on this so much? And there is no study where the radiometric age of a rock agreed with the known age of the rock. Do you know that? There is no study where the radiometric age of a rock agreed with the known age of the rock. You can't, and they'll say it's because it's not reliable for like small amounts of time. But if you can't even test it for small amounts of time, why do you think you can test it for millions of years? So, do you feel lied to yet? Because this is, you might start thinking that some of this is agenda-driven. Okay, question 5. Distant starlight, this is one of my favorite questions, from stars billions of light years away should have taken billions of years to reach Earth, and the fact that we see them seems like evidence for an old universe. A few of you had this question, and it's a good question. So the first way I want to answer this is I want to say whether or not science has a good answer to this question. So does science have a good answer to the distant starlight question? Now you might say, well, of course science does, because we have this Big Bang, right? And that means everything started in one place. But it turns out that that actually does not solve the question. And people noticed a long time ago when the Big Bang theory was first created, or the first envisioned, that the problem is that there is something called the microwave background radiation. And if you look at the microwave background radiation of the universe, if you just look at the night sky, you see that the temperature everywhere seems to be very uniform. And the fact is that you would not expect that given the Big Bang model, because these places have been so far away that they can't actually communicate. So there's no way for them to come into thermal equilibrium. And it would take extreme fine-tuning to get every part of this universe, if you believe the Big Bang model, to come into thermal equilibrium with each other, right? Because they basically never touched. So how did secular scientists solve this problem? Well, it turns out, and by the way, this is called the horizon problem. It's very well known. And they solved this problem by do I have the next slide? Okay, not yet. They solved this problem by something called inflation, right? So inflation, you'll hear about this, is this process where the universe became like this very small place that everything sort of came into thermal equilibrium, and then for like some fraction of a second or something, it like expands at the speed of like much faster than the speed of light. The problem is this is a completely completely not understood process. There's no real theories on how it starts or how it ends. Nobody knows really anything about this process except that it seems to solve this problem, right? It was invented to solve this problem. So the problem that I want to let you know that is this problem of distant starlight is the same problem as secular scientists have. how do you get light to travel faster than it seems like time has allowed? Right? That is the problem, right? Like in our creation account, we see light from different stars, and we're like, how did I get here? Like, it didn't seem like in 6,000 years you have time for light to get here. But in Big Bang cosmology, you have the same problem. You just don't hear about it because there's a little thing called inflation they put in to sort of hide the problem. But nobody knows anything about it, right? So there's a lot of other problems about the Big Bang that we can talk about some other time, but there's things that you would expect if the Big Bang was true, like the matter and antimatter ratio and things like this, but really technical. Okay, so I think this is one of these things where the less you know about science, the more you put faith into it. But what about creationists? Do we have an answer to this problem? Well, I'll give you two possible solutions. And again, I'll just say that Scripture doesn't tell us, right? So a lot of this stuff is sort of like speculation, and that's some of it is okay to do that because we want to apply our logic to the Scriptures, but maybe we'll never know, and we have to be kind of okay with that. This is sort of like one of these things we take by faith. However, there are two interesting and intriguing solutions. And one is something called Dasha, which was developed by this guy named Faulkner in 2013. And this is based on Genesis 1:11. So the word Dasha is, I guess, Hebrew for sprout. And if you look at the Genesis account here, it says, God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed. And then it says later on that the earth brought forth vegetation. And, Faulkner, I guess, who developed this theory, notice that these words seem to imply that there is some time involved in this. It wasn't that the vegetation instantaneously appeared, but it seemed like they sprouted. It seemed like they grew, maybe in an accelerated time scale, right? Maybe they grew extremely fast. Maybe somehow, and obviously the mechanism of the process of this is impossible to determine, but it seems like maybe if you were there and you could see with your eyes, you would actually see it sprout from the ground faster than perhaps you would be used to today. Okay, so the idea now is, of course, you can apply that to this, to light. And what this person said is, as part of God's formative work, light from astronomical bodies was miraculously made to shoot its way to Earth at an abnormally accelerated rate in order to fulfill their function of serving as signs, seasons, days, and years. So that is one possible theory. That would be a miracle. It's not based on scientific theories. And if you want to ask how it's happened, how that would happen, it would be like asking how Jesus raised himself from the dead, right? Like some miracles you just don't have a scientific mechanism for. Some people find this to be unsatisfactory for that reason. I don't have such a big problem with it. But here's a second possible solution. And this is from Jason Lyle. And he calls it the anisotropic synchrony convention, which is actually really fascinating if you look at the physics. And if you have any questions about this, you can ask Ian Peng over there. He's a lot better at math than I am. But he basically says there is no problem. Now, I'm going to try to sort of explain this in like 2 seconds, right? Because I'm running out of time. But the idea is that Einstein came up with this. Okay, so here's how it is, okay? We tend to think about time happening simultaneously because we live on this Earth, and we don't live in like astronomical time scales or astronomical length scales. But since we live closer together, we can basically synchronize our watches. I can come up to Mike and be like, it is 9:49 right now. What do you have? 9:49. Okay, we can synchronize our watches. But it turns out that the farther you get from each other, the more difficult that is to do, and it becomes impossible to do at long enough length scales. And this has to do with, at long enough length scales, time behaves very unintuitively. And Einstein, in his theory of general relativity, really sort of brought out a lot of the weird implications of this. And one is that you'll probably hear about is that time passes differently depending on how fast you're moving, right? So if you're moving fast, time slows down. This is, a lot of science fiction is based on this stuff. And in popular lingo, it's called time dilation, all this stuff. Anyways, the one weird implication about this is that there is no actual universal now shared by anybody in the universe. Like, you can't actually objectively say, this is now, and like 20 million light years, that is also now. Because the speed of light is really constant. It's like if things don't interact, right? If things don't see each other, then they don't interact. And that speed of which they see each other is governed by the speed of light. You can't go faster than that. So it doesn't actually make sense to say things are happening at the same time. It's a weird concept. And so what do? Well, you can literally decide your reference frame, okay? So you can say, like, well, there's no like objective standard of like what time it is at that star right now, and I can't synchronize my watch to it because that's impossible. But I can decide that it's happening right now. What I see right now in the sky, that is happening right now. So I'll just look at I'll just like point you to his words here. Under that convention, no distant starlight problem. There is no distant starlight problem because the creation of stars is concurrent with the arrival of their first light on Earth. No time is required to traverse the distance, and we see that universe as it is now. Okay, and so the only reason we think there's a problem is because we're not used to this way that time actually works. All right, and let's see. So what is the implication of this? So the significance of the distant starlight issue is that it's just as legitimate to say, if you look at Alpha Centauri in the telescope, are we seeing it now or are we seeing it 4.3 years ago? Because that's 4.3 light years away, right? So are we seeing it now or are we seeing it as 4.3 years ago? And you can actually simply decide that you're seeing it now. And the implication of that is that the speed of light, you can just decide, is not constant in both directions. So like the speed of light coming this way and the speed of light going that way, we would think, well, that's just going to be the same. Like, it's the same in both directions. But you can literally decide as a convention that the speed of light coming from the star here is instant, and the speed of light going from here to the star is half of the speed of light, half of c. And you can decide as a convention that that is happening right now. And because of relativity, because of all this math, you can never tell the difference. Those two conventions are going to be the same. Okay, it's like an accounting trick, right? So there is basically no distant starlight problem in this model. And in order to really understand this, you have to really dive into it on all the math. But this is a pretty cool one. Okay, so anyways, in both of these solutions, I just want to say there is no deception because literally you're seeing it as it happens. Okay, let's go through the next one. I know we have a few minutes. All right, humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. Why aren't there humans found with dinosaur bones? This is also a good question. So one thing I want to just establish in 1 minute is that it does seem like there are dinosaurs in the Bible. This is just one verse. In Job 40, it talks about a mysterious animal with strength in his loins, tall as a cedar. He has a nose. Sorry, he also has a tail. And if you just look at this, the behemoth, there's not really an earthly animal that corresponds to this. The elephant doesn't fit because it doesn't have a tail. And this looks like a pretty good representation of what that verse is talking about. This is a Brachiosaurus. But there's also other places in Job that kind of does the same thing. Okay, another thing I want to show you is they actually have discovered soft tissue in T-Rexes. So they found like these sort of soft tissue in these fossils, and you begin to wonder that if it's millions of years old, how could that still be around, right? This is an intriguing story. So this is there's a living fossil. Have you guys heard of this one? This is the coelacanth, all right? So this is a coelacanth, and it's a fossil that was found to be 360 millions of years old to 800 millions of years old. And in fact, they thought it went extinct with the dinosaurs because you see the fossils in the same layers as the dinosaurs and all this stuff. And there was unanimous agreement about this until in 1938, they found it swimming around in the ocean. And it hasn't changed. It's the same animal. And in fact, you look at that animal and you look at what else is in the ocean and you see whales, all right? And whales, according to the evolutionary theory, were evolved, I guess, 50 million years ago. So there's about 50 million years where you might have seen some fossils of whales and coelacanths together. But you don't see them. There are no fossils of whales and coelacanths together. So does that mean that whales and coelacanths don't live at the same time? No, they live at the same time today, okay? So you can actually just go to the ocean and see them living at the same time. But there are no fossils where they're at the same time. And so you start to wonder, why, does then the fact that dinosaurs and humans are not found at the same time, does that prove that dinosaurs and humans do not live together? And the answer is no, okay? It turns out that if you think about the Noah's flood and how we believe all the fossils kind of were created right in the beginning of sort of the flood time, maybe less than a year, right? That's where everything died, everything was buried. That you have to have that burial, by the way, to create the flood, to create the fossils. If you think that that's all, what are the odds in that short time period that you'll see men and dinosaurs? I mean, are you going to live next to a dinosaur if you're a man? Is that, you're going to try to probably keep your distance, right? But at that time, that gives you maybe 6 months to create fossils. But in this model, in this evolutionary model, you have 50 million years to create whales and coelacanths at the same time, or really any sort of combination of fossils, right? Which we don't see. There's many, many different combinations of fossils that you would think you would see. You know they live at the same time, but you don't see them together, okay? And we're not going to have time to look at this video, but we used to have a video. So we're not going to have time to read it. This is a cool video, but we're already over time. Okay, so what does that tell you? Well, two things. One is, it does not prove anything that you don't see humans and dinosaurs at the same time. Perhaps they just did not live together, and we only had 6 months to make that fossil anyways. However, there's a lot of other fossils you don't find together. So you ask the question then, so why is this talking point, or why is this question so frequently brought up? Why isn't that two different trees that you would find at the same time, the fossils aren't found together? Why isn't that brought up that much? And that's because it's an agenda-driven question, right? It's a question that's specifically created. Even evolutionists know that this is not proof because they see many, many fossils that they don't find at the same time. So this is an agenda-driven question. You wouldn't expect necessarily that you would ever see that. But maybe we will, and maybe we'll find it. But if they do find it, do you think they'll change their mind? No. That's not the point of that question, right? All right, I think we're going to have to skip this. This is just basically what AI and social media say on this topic. I basically asked a bunch of AIs in answering this question, what it thought if you were a biblical creationist. And actually, all of the AIs are six-day creationists, interestingly enough. The only one that was a little bit sort of hand-wavy on the issue was Claude, Anthropic, which tried to be yeah, no, it's could be both sides. All right. For more information, do I have my bag there? So these are some of the books that I really appreciated when I was looking at these topics. The best one, I think, if you're going to read a book, is the first one, Old Earth Creationism on Trial. It's kind of short, and it's kind of it's very informative. It kind of does this thing as a jury type of trial, which is kind of interesting. Commentary of just the Genesis is if you're very technical and you want a lot of sort of theological lingo. And of course, there's always the Answer in Genesis stuff. Biblical Science Institute is from Jason Lyles, so if you want a lot more astronomy stuff, that's also a good resource. And as I promised, there's a whole bunch of books here that are free for you guys. And if you ask the question, you can just pick one up, but after you wait for a minute, You guys can all pick one up if you want. So there's like, one's on astronomy, one's on Satan, one on Satan and the serpent, one on compromise. Best evidence is dinosaurs, young Earth. Did God create in 6 days? Should Christians believe in old Earth? So there's a whole bunch of these pocket guides that Dwayne got for basically a discount. But I want to give it out to you guys, so take them. And maybe even if you're going to read it, definitely take it. And if you want to give it out, that's okay too. So I'll just leave them here. You guys can look through them. Okay, sorry, I really did not leave enough questions time, but we'll have another Q&A at some point. So if you guys really want to, you can ask me some hard questions. All right, let me close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for the clarity of your word, and even though we struggle to really understand many of these things because they're so wonderful, and who can understand your mind and why you do this, the way things you do, but we want to know. And all we can do is trust your word over that of fallible man. You are the one who can create the heavens and the earth in an instant if you so choose, but you did that in 6 days as an example to us. Lord, so help us, Lord, to understand these things and also to marvel at your creative work, to marvel at your power, and then to be able to go out and defend this doctrine to people who don't believe, who don't agree. Because we do believe that it is a doctrine in which most of the other parts of Scripture, including the redemption story, is built on. So we thank you, Lord, and praise in Christ's name, amen.